to see some familiar faces and names in the little boxes at the top of my screen. I'm going to just share my screen for my PowerPoint presentation here. Okay, there we go. Can I just see thumbs up if folks can see it? Yep, okay, perfect. Thanks so much. So when invited to do this talk, I thought long and hard about what the focus should be. And I thought I would share a couple of recent scholarly endeavors related to this topic of linguistic diversity and teacher education. But I thought as well, I would do some meta-analysis of the transnational partnerships that led to this scholarship. I anticipate that most of the group here is involved directly in the colloquium and or other graduate students may have joined in. And I know that working transnationally is an interest for many OISE graduate students, as is co-publishing and just publishing generally. So I'm going to talk both about the work itself, but also about some of the strategies that led to the work and can lead to successful transnational partnerships and co-authorships. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the two pieces. I'll put up the references in a moment, but the first piece of scholarship I'd like to talk a little bit about is a co-authored piece that attempts to problematize and expand understandings of translanguaging and really to look at the nuances of how translanguaging plays out. Though I think those of us interested in language education can all agree that translanguaging is a wonderful, inclusive approach that allows for different elements of students' linguistic repertoires to be honored. How this plays out in pedagogy can be challenging. And so the paper that I authored with two colleagues from Luxembourg sort of talks about some of the challenges, and I'd like to highlight some of our findings. I'd also like to talk about some longer term efforts I've made as a teacher education scholar to really help prepare teachers to be more critically oriented researchers in their professional practice. And I was thrilled to see Antoinette Gagne here. We have a long-term relationship and some very interesting collaborations over the years. And Antoinette and I have written about this together, and I've written about it individually as well. But this notion of really developing a more robust critical pedagogy in language teacher education and teacher education generally, so that teachers aren't simply consumers of policy and consumers of research, that they're actively engaged in researching, in looking again critically at some of the policies they're expected to engage with, as well as critically evaluating their own practices. And so then through this, I will consider this sort of meta-narrative on what is involved in facilitating a successful transnational partnership, and how can we work more collaboratively across contexts to enact more critical teacher education. So these are the two pieces that the students in the colloquium were asked to prepare for tonight, and that I will be referencing. The first is a recent contribution to a Multilingual Matters volume. The volume itself is entitled Multilingualism, Immobilities, and Spaces of Belonging. And my colleagues and I considered the extent to which translanguaging, different kinds of translanguaging, is considered legitimate across different educational contexts. And we know that there are nuances and hierarchies to how translanguaging is perceived. So we analyze some of our findings across the Manitoba setting where I'm based and the Luxembourg school system. And the second piece is another recent chapter stemming from a German volume looking at schools as sites of migration. and looking at what teacher education for social justice, what some examples of that look like in the Canadian context. So I didn't want to assume that everybody knows Manitoba, where I'm based. Um, right, the three big cities, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, often get all the attention, especially in some of the research pertaining to migration, to linguistic and cultural diversity. So I just wanted to show you where Manitoba is. We're the geographical center of the country. The reason our climate is so much colder than yours is because we're quite a bit further north when you look at us, how it's spread out. And we border with Nunavut in the north and have some very remote and northern locations that are not accessible in the wintertime via road. They're fly-in only communities in the north. And these are predominantly Indigenous communities. So just to give you some of the demographics of Manitoba so you understand the context in which some of my research takes place, we're currently sitting at about 1.4 million in terms of our population. I know, smaller than the population of Toronto, and that's the population of our entire province. Winnipeg is by far the largest city with about 800,000 or so. And the second largest city would be Brandon with about 200,000. They've really been growing as a city with immigration to the community, largely in response to provincial nominee, to some of the labor shortages in that area of the province. So we do see immigration as a big driver in Manitoba, but we also see that per capita, Manitoba has the highest population of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in the province. My university is based on Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Yesterday's holiday is not called Family Day in Manitoba, it's called Louis Riel Day to acknowledge his significant contributions. And so I just wanted to acknowledge the land from which I'm speaking. And certainly our First Nations population is one of the fastest growing in Canada. It's in Canada and provincially. And within the last couple of weeks, we have, we always have news items related to developments that are reflective of some of the larger challenges we face as educators and as a society. But recently, there was a very public condemnation issued by the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs on the basis of a racist incident within the fire and paramedic services, where at the beginning of February, a young Indigenous woman who was bleeding from a knife wound in her neck did not receive proper care. In fact, she was required to put a cloth on her own wound in the ambulance because the paramedic said he wasn't going to do it. And this was directly attributed to racism and is, of course, emblematic of wider systemic racism. So I mention all of this because even though my talk narrows in a little bit on linguistic diversity, I don't think we can ever consider language in isolation from some of the other isms in society. And I very much take an intersectional lens in how I consider some of these concerns. And when we're advocating for more linguistically inclusive societies, I think we have to acknowledge what other systemic barriers may be influential in our efforts. So the context of my university, we are the largest and the only medical doctoral university in the province. We have approximately 30,000 students. 6,000 of those are international students. Very diverse population, lots of intersectionality. And this stems in part from large numbers of Indigenous students, course, Canada's aggressive immigration policies, and the fact that international students at our institution pay approximately 3 times the tuition fees, which support other academic programs. What that looks like in the post-COVID era, I think we're all wondering about, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of my discussion. I just wanted to give you a bit of a context and a history of the demographics of my institution. So we know that this is based on some of the Canadian Teachers Federation data, but we know that coping with diversity in the classroom, responding with culturally affirming and culturally responsive pedagogy remains a huge challenge for Canadian teachers. Learning exceptionalities and language learning needs top the list of some of the perceived challenges. There are also, of course, opportunities for implementing more inclusive practices in education. So I don't mean to frame diversity as a problem, but we know that given the systemic pressures on teachers, often inadequate resources to responding well to that diversity, sometimes dubious professional development support for teachers, that these can be substantive challenges for them. I take this stance, and this is reflected in many of my publications over the last decade and a half, but that critical teacher education pedagogy needs to be a foundation of education. And I have there in the lower right-hand corner, the image is the Bentwood Box, which it was crafted to honor and support the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was headed by newly retired Senator Murray Sinclair, a former judge, who there was a huge report issued in 2015, calls to action stemming from the investigation into the legacy and impact of residential schooling on Indigenous populations. And this was the legacy of residential schools. In case folks are not familiar with the residential school system, this was an institutionalized, government-sanctioned form of what's been termed widely across the country cultural genocide, although arguably it incorporated genocide of other dimensions as well. And this was 150 years of a school system that removed Indigenous children from their families, often isolated them, marginalized them, abused them, and separated them from their families and culture and language. So that by the time the system was done with them, if they survived the system, they were left in an in-between space of not belonging to white settler society and also not feeling an affinity with their home communities. So really quite an atrocious legacy. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was tasked with looking at the impact and documenting the experiences of survivors. And so the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is housed at my university, and so is the Bentwood Box. And the box was created so that Indigenous survivors giving testimony could contribute items and artifacts that would symbolize both the legacy of residential schools, but also paths to reconciliation. And so various First Nations groups are reflected in the sculptures on each side of the box. But the reason I have it here in a slide about the need for critical teacher education pedagogy is because in a recent magazine, in a recent University of Manitoba magazine, the Bentwood Box, an image of this box was placed beside an advertisement for a fundraising campaign. And when you looked at the images juxtaposed, it almost looked as though the Bentwood Box was like a money donation box, because it's like advertising, you know, give us money, donate to the U of M. And then you've got the Bentwood Box, and it looked like, is there a slot at the top for envelopes? Like you kind of had those wonderings. And it was disturbing to see the Bentwood Box framed in that way. And so it was just one example really of how more critical orientations to some of the discourses and the types of materials that teachers are exposed to really needs to be foundational to the work that we do. So that was just one example I wanted to share. So I've argued a little bit already about criticality being foundational. I think we still struggle in teacher education with the fact that critical issues of social justice are still competing alongside many other curriculum content areas and components of teacher education. And it seems like every subspecialty is jockeying for its position in the teacher education curriculum. And I think it's high time, in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and other key social justice movements that are happening as we speak, that we start seeing social justice as the foundation of teacher education, and not as something to add on and to infuse in bits and pieces where we can, but really to be a more crucial pillar of teacher education. I also think that in order to accomplish this, we need teacher candidates who function as critical researchers. And this is something Antoinette and I have written about. We've written about with our colleague, Paula Marcus. But the idea that teachers need methodologies to critically interrogate some of the artifacts, some of the materials, the discourses, the policies, and also, if they want to conduct critical action research on their own practice. So that was a little bit of a, setting the stage for some of my work. And I wanted to then shift to talk a little bit about this partnership with the Luxembourg colleagues who I co-authored the first reading that some of you prepared for tonight. So I thought just to explain how this transnational partnership came about, because I think when we're preparing researchers, like when we're talking about research methods and methodologies, we think in very pragmatic terms, and we don't necessarily attend as much to some of the relationship building that is required to ensure a successful collaboration. And so I mentioned some of the history of the development of this article just to give that meta level of inquiry into this issue. So in 2016, I was invited to participate in a conference in Luxembourg on the theme of borderscapes. Borderscapes is a theoretical area that I think really came to the fore with some of the mass migration of Syrian refugees. But it's a robust theoretical frame that takes border crossing as a theory and kind of expands it and makes it relevant to a wide variety of settings. So just as we have landscapes to talk about geographical location, borderscapes helps talk about borders in all of their myriad forms, their fluidity, and their complexity. Like a border is not simply a physical demarcation, right? We can have psychological border crossing happening and border crossing of theories in a way. So borderscapes helps to address some of that. And I was invited to present on my longstanding research agenda, which looks at teacher diversity and diversifying the teaching force in migrant receiving jurisdictions. And so the chair who was assigned to my session to comment on my work happened to be a professor of applied linguistics and German studies at the University of Luxembourg, and we got into conversation about what was certainly coming to the fore at that time as a very popular concept, this notion of translanguaging. And we both had concern that translanguaging was being thrown around and discussed as a sort of panacea for all things that are wrong in linguistically diverse education systems. And so that's where the conversation began. And then we continued to talk about this at the American Association of Applied Linguistics conference the following year. And this is where the idea for the joint publication emerged. And we brought in, there was a third researcher, actually Sarah Mueller, who took the lead on the article, but she was a PhD student at the time of Jean-Jacques Weber, my colleague in Luxembourg. And so we decided to collaborate on this topic. And this is just to point out that sometimes the most fruitful collaborations come when you meet colleagues with shared interests and realize that you both have something already to contribute to a new exploration of a topic. So we didn't set out and say, well, we're going to start from scratch and do a brand new research project together. I had data from my context and they had data from theirs. And we decided we would do some comparative analysis of the similar issues that were raised in both of the cases that we presented. So sometimes the most fruitful partnerships aren't costly or particularly time consuming. It takes more time to publish things sometimes than to co-author and get a good collaboration off the ground. But that's how the comparative look at Luxembourg and Manitoba emerged. And I'm happy to talk in more detail about the findings of that piece. I'm just a little bit mindful of time, so I'll do this briefly, and then in the Q&A period, if you'd like to come back to anything, we certainly can. But what we attempted to do was really to broaden and expand the concept of translanguaging, and we traced its evolution because it was initially described by Garcia as pertaining to distinct named languages. And then she and many other scholars working in this area and advocating for translanguaging approaches pointed out that it really needed to encompass broad linguistic repertoires that may stem from a single named language and didn't necessarily come from two distinct languages, because it was important, right, that it is important that translanguaging incorporate an emphasis on varieties and registers and genres and proficiency in different areas to enhance linguistic performance and confidence and success. So we delineate in that article how translanguaging is fairly uncontentiously described as a practice and as a resource. But when it comes to talking about translanguaging as a skill and as a pedagogy, this is where things become a little bit murkier. It's not that translanguaging becomes invalid, it's that the ways in which translanguaging is taken up or not are contentious. And, we see, for example, when we consider translanguaging as a skill, we see how a neoliberal agenda has co-opted a lot of the uses of translanguaging in society, right? We see flashy marketing campaigns of big corporations that effectively incorporate translanguaging, but for the purpose of being trendy and of selling products. So it's not about a social justice agenda in that case. And, we also see similar concerns when we consider translanguaging as pedagogy, and the extent to which teachers feel comfortable enacting, supporting, enabling, and facilitating translanguaging in the classroom. Especially when the languages in question might be other than the official medium of instruction languages in school. That was certainly the case with Luxembourg. And in the context I described in Manitoba, the concerns around translanguaging had to do with Indigenous varieties of English and the extent, we're very keen to diversify the teaching force in Canada. We've long recognized that in most parts of Canada, the teaching force does not begin to reflect the cultural, linguistic diversity of our student populations. But when we're working with Indigenous teacher candidates in particular, or teacher candidates who speak varieties of English that are other than standard Canadian English, we do a very poor job at affirming the validity and the appropriateness of using other varieties of English in the classroom. There's still a deficit orientation, particularly when it comes to reservation English, as it's termed by some of the linguistic scholars I cited in my case. So through my self-study of my own teacher education practices, it became very apparent that we need to do better, and we need to be more mindful and cognizant of deliberately acknowledging and validating the Indigenous varieties that some of our teacher candidates are proficient in. And so the point of our discussion was really to emphasize that if social transformation is a goal, then we can't divorce translanguaging from the larger political agenda. And I think that was one of our main sort of points in that piece. So again, just mindful of time, I'll move on to talking a little bit about the partnership with the Bremen colleagues. And this emerged from a time several years ago when I had the chance to spend some time at the Institute of Migration and Intercultural Studies at the University of Osnabrück in Germany. And Bremen is just an hour north by train from Osnabrück. So when the opportunity came to visit Bremen and to give a talk there, I jumped at the opportunity. At the time, one of our colleagues there, Professor Yasemin Kerekashoglu, she was the rector of the university at the time, and she's a senior professor in intercultural education and migration studies. And so we developed sort of a relationship from there, though it took a bit of time for momentum to be gathered. Sometimes this happens. You meet a colleague that you'd like to collaborate with, a seed is planted, but it doesn't necessarily come to fruition immediately just because of other competing demands that might be happening. So we continued to talk, and in the meantime, her research group also developed a partnership with colleagues at OISE, including Antoinette Gagne and Jeff Bale. And so there seemed to be more momentum and opportunity to continue the meaningful discussions that we'd had back in 2014. And at the time, Yasemin was doing a project looking at migration in schools in Germany, and migration in all kinds of diverse ways. So looking at border towns on the border of Germany, where people would go back and forth across the border to attend school, as well as international study abroad opportunities, refugee education. So many facets of migrant education were addressed in her project. And in the fall of 2019, she was looking to come to Toronto as one of the international sites to see how migration was being taken up in schools. And since we had a pre-existing connection, she also decided to come to Winnipeg. And so I was able to put together a slate of school visits and opportunities for her to see what was happening, and actually some of the very culturally responsive pedagogy that's evident in some of our very diverse classrooms and schools here. So Then the research seminar, so to conclude her migration in schools project, there was a big seminar in Bremen with all of the school partners. 20 different school leaders came together. And so I was the researcher from Canada. There was representation from New York, from Sweden, and there's one other country that I'm forgetting now who was also part of the partnership as sort of an international comparison. And we came together for several days of debriefing the research findings and talking about how to translate research into practice and policy in schools. And one of the principals from a local Winnipeg school accompanied me on that trip, and his school is quite a unique site where there are a lot of migrant students, there are a lot of Indigenous students, there's some very creative programming being put in place to meet students' needs. And so this principal, his name is Vin, he had the opportunity to tell his story of what he's accomplishing in his school. And I think it was very powerful for our German colleagues to hear about what's happening in other settings and for us to reciprocally learn from them. So I remember this trip vividly because it happened just as the COVID lockdown was happening. It was my last trip out of Canada before everything shut down in mid-March. I think I returned from Germany March 7th of 2020. And then by the following week, our life as we know it had changed drastically. So anyway, so the partnership with colleagues in Bremen continues, and Jeff and Antoinette and I have been working the last couple of months to support a seminar that offers a transnational comparison of migrant receiving schools in Canada and Germany. And interestingly, the University of Bremen has an institute which is called the Institute of Canada and Quebec Studies. Quebec is somewhat separate in that designation, which I find really interesting. But you know, so there's a lot of interest in looking at what's happening, and when opportunities like that are present and there's a real interest, you know, I think there are all kinds of possibilities for collaborative projects, collaborative scholarship. And so this is what led to my contribution to the volume that was published. And in that volume, I talk about a long-standing teacher education practice that I've implemented for quite a while now, in order to explicitly challenge some of the deficit discourses that are used to discuss students who have English as an additional language, and to discuss their families. And so I shared this with colleagues in Germany, and also decided it was time to sort of publish this practice more robustly. But this is an ongoing exercise that I do. It's an activity. It's in a way training, preparing teachers to be critical discourse analysts with some of what they are engaging with, but also what they are constructing in terms of discourses about students. And so this is what I call, you know, restoring the conversation, where in the left-hand column, these comments reflect, they're not verbatim quotes from my teacher candidates, but they are composite examples of the types of discourse that have been very prevalent among some of my students over the years that I've worked in teacher education. So the judgment that if EAL, we use the term English as an additional language in Manitoba, if ESL students, if their parents have lower levels of education, then there's sometimes a very problematic and racist tendency to write them off as not being able to contribute to their children's education because they may not support education in traditional, some of the traditionally expected ways. Of course, there are many researchers who problematize this. Carl James comes to mind from York University, and some of his work looking at Black single moms who work multiple shifts end to end to ensure that their children have shelter, have food on the table, have a safe, warm place to study and learn. She may not be able to sit down and do every homework assignment with her kids because she's working to put food on the table, but to suggest that that effort is somehow indicative that she's not supportive of her children's education, I mean, that's a very wrong-headed assumption that we need to challenge. So getting at that judgment and then rewording the narrative to suggest a more open-ended, critical suspension of judgment as we learn more about our EAL learners and families was really the intent of the alternate wording provided in the right-hand column. And so I did this with a number of the discourses that I have found prevalent, not just in teacher education classrooms at the pre-service level, but to be honest, many of these sentiments I've heard over the 17 years I've been going into Manitoba staff rooms to do professional development for local educators. You know, the stereotypes and problematic assumptions and discrimination remain pretty entrenched in some of the thinking and the systemic approaches. And so my intent with this task is to really try to address that head on and point out why some of this discourse is highly problematic, what is being assumed here, and why we need to take a step back and really reframe the story to be more appropriate, to be more responsive, and to really adopt an anti-discriminatory approach in language education, but really in all facets of education. We know that, and this harkens back a little bit to the Luxembourg collaboration, but we know that students who don't speak the dominant language of instruction are still often framed very much from a deficit perspective. And that's something, again, that needs to shift. And this is where, too, I think more nuanced understandings of translanguaging need to enter the conversation. And recognizing the linguistic repertoire that students have. These are not really revolutionary arguments. They've been around in language education for a long time. You know, I think back to some of Vivian Cook's work in the early 1990s, where he was arguing, you know, we have to start seeing our ESL students as multi-competent language users, not deficient speakers of English. But the message is not internalized sometimes among sort of dominant stakeholders who have mastery of English because that is the one language that they speak, and sort of assume a universality about it that continues to disadvantage our linguistically and culturally diverse students. So the advocacy is still very much needed, and concrete examples of how to shift the discourse into a more appropriate and responsive pedagogy, I think, is very much needed. So that's what I've talked about in that second chapter, framing it within a critical teacher education pedagogy. So those are a few examples there. So I'd like to wrap up shortly and allow ample time for comments and questions, because that's always the best part. I just thought to mention, so this was the piece I contributed to the German volume I mentioned, and Both of these collaborations I've highlighted here today, the one with colleagues from Luxembourg and the one with colleagues from Bremen, have been really positive examples of transnational partnerships, and both very fruitful. The Luxembourg one isn't ongoing at the moment, but the Bremen one is. And so I'm happy to share some positive examples, but it also got me thinking about the times in my research career where some transnational partnerships have been more successful than others. And, I had just a few summarizing lessons learned to share with you on this basis, because it seems to me that transnational partnerships are something many of us are working with or working toward. And so I thought to just mention a few insights that I've gleaned over the years. I do think for me, the most fruitful partnerships have stemmed from relationships that have been established over time in different academic settings. So like I said, sometimes a seed is planted and it doesn't bear fruit for a while, but that's okay. I do think that, having some good insight into who your partners are, I don't mean scrutinizing their personal lives. I just mean having a sense of the extent to which you share academic objectives, to what extent are your ideologies and research paradigms compatible. I think that's something to keep in mind. It's not to say that we don't benefit from diverse perspectives, but I find if there are paradigmatic differences that make collaboration very difficult, maybe that's the intent of the project, is to really bring together different paradigms. But I do find that some, paradigmatic compatibility can be a precursor to a successful partnership. So I just emphasize that as a priority. I do think it's important to be clear about the roles, and if this is a joint paper you're doing, if it's a joint conference presentation, if you're working on a co-authored book with somebody, it's really quite important to delineate the different contributions and what these are going to look like and what each contributor's expectations are. And sometimes when you're excited about the thrill, like starting a new project is always thrilling, so sometimes we forego some of the pragmatic discussions about how this is going to work and who's going to do what and when is this going to happen. But you never want to be in a situation where you feel like you've been that you've overextended yourself, or to make a partnership work, you've had to engage in some maybe problematic compromises that you hadn't anticipated. So thinking some of that through, I think, is really important. Like I said, some of the best partnerships I've had have involved no money whatsoever. We just sort of scrape together and make things happen where we can. But so it's not necessarily dependent on having large scale funding. And in fact, some of the greatest difficulties I've had in transnational partnerships has been where there's been a lot of money at stake, because it seems to sort of elevate the tensions when there's quite a lot of funding on the table, and funding is often not equally distributed among partners, right? There's often one lead researcher at one institution who holds the purse strings. And so that's just something to think about. It's not to discourage you from contemplating such partnerships, but I do think where resources are implicated, there again needs to be very clear expectations and agreements up front. For example, in some places, it's just more expensive to do research than others, right? If you're based in the GTA and you're doing research, but travel to your research sites takes longer because you're working in a highly populated area, it's more expensive to travel, it takes longer, then the amount of resources you need to undertake data collection for that project will be higher than someone who's perhaps working in a smaller jurisdiction where travel time is negligible and it's more straightforward and just less expensive to carry out the same tasks. And I think sometimes I've seen when resources are divided up in a project, it's just sort of a pie that's cut up equally, but not realizing that it might be creating some inequities for some of the research teams involved. So then I do think that strategies in place for working through any tensions or disagreements can also be fruitful. And so I mention all of this. I hope I've tied it together adequately with some of the work, but because these were based on transnational collaborations, I felt that it was useful to just offer that bird's eye view of some of the considerations involved in doing transnational work, in the hopes of, smoothing the pathway for some of the researchers who are also engaging in this type of collaboration. So that is what I have to share for tonight. And I'm very open to hear your thoughts, your questions, and reactions. Thank you so much.
Thank you